Chapter 8. So Many Marvels. The world was stirred by great events in the 17th century. It was then that the English ventured to plant their colonies at Jamestown and at Plymouth, that Champlain built the first French habitation in North America, and Henry Morgan the pirate plundered Panama. In the 17th century, the King of England was deposed and executed, but the Stuart kings were put back on the English throne after Oliver Cromwell died. The planted fields of Germany were laid to waste by marching soldiers in the 30 Years' War, and Louis XIV ruled in splendor at Versailles. Many other events might be added to this list, and all are important. All changed the world's history and altered the lives of men. In science, one of the most important occurrences, an occurrence of far reaching influence, was the microscopes coming into common use among scientific men. The microscope gave men new power. Now they could see a whole host of things that had been hidden. Now, looking down in wonder through their lenses, they could see into an infinitely fascinating, minute, and hitherto unknown world. It has been said that a Dutch spectacles maker named Zacharias Janssen made the first compound microscope in about 1590, but this is by no means sure. Some people claim that Galileo, who fashioned the first astronomical telescope, also ground the lenses of the first microscope, but no one can prove that either. Whoever first invented them, these microscopes were wonderful things. Some of them had only single lenses, some had double lenses with a tube between them. The sights they uncovered were a marvel to see, a whole world with its own beauties, a world totally unlike the world a man could see with his own eyes. A fly's eye through a microscope was not a brown speck, but a little glass dome made of many discs fastened together. A drop of milk was a mass of silvery globules. A crumb of bread was a rough country of branching columns, and a bit of mold was a garden full of graceful plants. It was no wonder that almost every scientist in the 17th century wanted to own a microscope if he could. Signor Marcello Malpighi, professor at the medical school at Pisa in Italy, wanted very much to get a microscope. He was sure that if this instrument was all that it was said to be, it would be extremely useful to him. For Signor Malpighi was lecturing to his students on the organs of the human body, and there was still so much about the human body he did not know. There was the question of how the lungs were made. Most people thought they were masses of flesh and blood infiltrated with air. The professor doubted if this was true, but he had no way of proving the truth one way or the other. And then there was William Harvey's theory of circulation of the blood. The theory had great acclaim in Europe, but no one could say how the blood passed from the arteries into the veins. Perhaps, thought Signor Malpighi, if I could examine some small animal like a frog under the microscope, I might make some discoveries. What is true of a frog might also be true of a human being. Therefore he sent for a microscope. The microscope arrived in due course. He set it up on his table and prepared a frog to study beneath its lens. Signor Malpighi was 33 years old then. It was the year 1661. It is easy to imagine the quiet room, the pale, bearded face poised above the microscope's tube, the dissected frog lying quiet, the hand with a pencil ready to sketch what the eye could see. Quote, "It is as I thought," unquote, Signor Malpighi must have murmured to himself. There under the lens he saw the frog's lung. It was sufficiently transparent to reveal a network of fibers. He looked more closely. He saw air cells enclosed by folds of lining membrane and some divided by smaller folds. Upon the edges of all the folds ran little blood vessels. The frog's heart was still beating, and he could see the bloodstream coursing in finer and finer hair-like vessels as it passed from artery to vein through a closed network. After many days' study, Malpighi still did not understand the relation of the air to the blood in the lung, but he had found the capillary network between arteries and veins. He turned his lenses on other animals. Finally, he saw the tiny capillaries connecting arteries and veins in the human body. Then he knew he had completed what William Harvey had begun. His microscope had made it possible to trace the complete circuit of blood in the human body. Now he turned his lens to the study of other parts of the body, and he studied the liver, the spleen, the skin. His fame was spreading through Europe fast, though he was a gentle, modest man and lived quietly because of fragile health. About 6 years after he had started his work with the microscope, he received a letter from Henry Oldenburg, secretary of the Royal Society in London. Would he enter into correspondence with the society? The letter asked. Malpighi responded gladly, and the next year he was made Fellow of the Royal Society, a very great honor indeed. Soon Henry Oldenburg was asking whether Malpighi would make a special study for the society. He suggested as a possible topic the anatomy of the silkworm. The microscope which Malpighi handled so cleverly was well adapted to the study of insects, which were then so little understood. Malpighi started the study at once, and worked so hard that his eyes became red and swollen, and he developed a fever. Nevertheless, he wrote, quote, in performing these researches, so many marvels of nature were spread before my eyes that I experienced an internal pleasure which my pen could not describe. Unquote. 2 years later, his study of the silkworm was ready, a set of drawings in pencil and red chalk, with every intricate, beautiful detail that he had so marveled at carefully set down. It was the first demonstration of the delicate design of an insect's body, and the Council of the Royal Society was so pleased with it that they ordered, quote, the History of the Silkworm by Signor Malpighi, dedicated to the Royal Society, be printed by the printers of the same, unquote. It was after this that Malpighi sent them his portrait. It hangs in the rooms of the Royal Society in London still. Now Malpighi began to peer through his microscope at other things. It is said that he walked through the garden of his friend with Viscount Ruffo, saw a broken branch of a chestnut tree, took it home, and began to study the structure of wood. He prepared a treatise for the Royal Society on the anatomy of plants, and sought to understand how life developed by opening hens' eggs each day to study beneath his lens the growth of the chicks inside. He worked incessantly for 30 years. He moved from Pisa back to Bologna, from Bologna to Messina, and then to Rome. And always, carefully packed, he must have taken his microscope with him. As the years passed, many of his works were published, but there were many he had not shown to anyone, and these were all lost in a fire. A friend, Dr. Tancred Robinson, wrote in April 18th, 1684, that he had witnessed their destruction. Quote, I had several conferences with Signor Malpighi in Bologna. He honored me with 2 visits at my inn. Just after I left Bologna, I had a lamentable spectacle of Malpighi's house all aflames, occasioned by the negligence of his old wife. All his pictures, furniture, books, and manuscripts were burned. I saw him in the very heat of the calamity, and methought I had never beheld so much Christian patience and philosophy in any man before, for he comforted his wife and condoled nothing but the loss of his papers. Unquote. Malpighi died not long after that. The night before his death, he dedicated a short account of the ear of an eagle and signed it with his own hand. Although so much of his work has been destroyed in the fire, what remained established his reputation as a very great scientist. He had demonstrated what could be accomplished by looking through a lens at things too delicate and minute to be studied otherwise. In Holland, not long after this Two other men were turning their lenses on other aspects of life. There was Jan Jacob Swammerdam and Anton van Leeuwenhoek. Jan Swammerdam was a very different man from the Italian Malpighi. While Malpighi had been gentle, patient, and sweet-tempered, Swammerdam was possessed of an irascible temper, and from earliest youth quarreled continuously with those around him. He was restless, suspicious, sharp-tongued. All this can be seen in the portrait of him that Rembrandt painted. His father was a rich apothecary who owned vessels that sailed to many parts of the world, and he had collected a large and rather famous museum of natural objects and strange creatures that fascinated the young Swammerdam. Much of his time in the years when he was growing up was spent in studying the creatures in his father's museum. There is a story that the Duke of Tuscany, on a visit to Amsterdam, went to see the nature museum the Swammerdams had assembled. Young Swammerdam wanted to impress the Duke, took a delicate instrument and slit open a caterpillar that was ready to pass into the pupal stage. From it he drew forth the butterfly with wings, legs, and proboscis packed up in the larval skin. The Duke was so impressed that he offered to buy the insect collection for 12,000 florins, and he wanted young Swammerdam to go back to Florence with him in his retinue. Swammerdam refused to go. He preferred to stay in Amsterdam with the things in the museum. His father, however, kept trying to get him to take up a profession. Would he be a priest? He would not even consider such a thing. Would he study medicine then? He did study medicine finally. In 1667, he took his MD degree at the University of Leiden. At the university, he used the microscope. He was fascinated by it. Looking through his lens, he was first to distinguish the red corpuscles of blood, a very important discovery for a young man to make. After he left the university, his father wanted him to go into practice, but young Swammerdam cared nothing but making researches with his microscope, his flea glass, his father called it. So he argued and quarreled with his father, and it is hard to know what might have come of it if he had not suddenly been stricken with a severe case of malaria. It was necessary for him to be sent to the country to recuperate. It was early summer. The fields were alive with bees, crickets, and grasshoppers, and Swammerdam had brought his microscope with him. What more natural than that he should rise every morning as soon as it was light and go out into the fields to study insects. He did not wear a hat because he thought it might interfere with the light. The sweat poured down his face as he worked. At night he returned to his room and made drawings of what he had observed. He spent a whole month in examining the intestines of bees. He then went on to other insects and their organs. At the end of his stay in the country, he was much sicker than he had been when he went. His eyes were so weakened that he could hardly use them in the afternoons. But his work on insects was a great masterpiece. Now he could point with authority to the position of the queen bee in the hive. He knew that the drones were males and the workers neuters. He had a good idea of the many-faceted eye of the bee, and he knew how its sting worked. He studied many other insects besides bees. He discovered the chitin, the horny substance which serves an insect as a kind of outer skeleton, and he learned all about the metamorphosis of insects. What impressed people about Swammerdam's work was its extreme fineness. His friend, Dr. Borev, who collected his writings after his death and published them under the title The Bible of Nature, marveled at the precision of Swammerdam's instruments. He wrote, quote, his microscopes were of various sizes and curvatures, his microscopical glasses being of various diameters and focuses, and from the least to the greatest, the best that could be procured in regard to the exactness of the workmanship and the transparency of the substance. But the constructing of fine scissors and giving them an extreme sharpness seems to have been his chief secret. These he made use of to cut very minute objects, because they dissect them equably, whereas knives and lancets, let them be ever so fine and sharp, are apt to disorder delicate substances. His knives, lancets, and styles were so fine that he could not see to sharpen them without the assistance of the microscope, but with them he could dissect the intestines of bees with the same accuracy and distinctness that others do those of large animals. Unquote. Swammerdam died when he was only 43. In the last years of his life, his microscopes and tiny instruments lay neglected, for he had become a religious fanatic and had been persuaded somehow that science was evil. Malpighi and Swammerdam both died early, having both perhaps burned out their lives by the intensity of their work, but Anton van Leeuwenhoek was not like them. He lived to the age of 92 and worked all his years with gusto and robust health. Malpighi had discovered minute things about the human body and plants and animals, and Swammerdam had first begun to understand the insect world, but Anton van Leeuwenhoek penetrated through lenses he himself had made into the mysterious world of the microbe. No one before his time had guessed that such tiny organisms existed. A queer old man, this Anton van Leeuwenhoek. He lived all his life in Delft. He had hardly an education and never learned Latin, which in those days was the mark of an educated man. He worked when a boy as a clerk in a dry goods shop. Part of his duty there was to examine textiles with a fine hand lens. Sometimes he placed the lenses over other substances beside the cloth, the skin of his own hand, with little hairs protruding from it, the fiber of the wood on the table. Extraordinary, he must have thought. How different things would look through a microscope. Later he owned a dry goods shop of his own, married, and brought up a family. But in his spare time he went to the spectacles makers and learned from them how to grind lenses. The lenses he made were precise and beautiful. Altogether he made 247 instruments, and some of them would increase the size of a minute object as much as 270 times. After he had learned to make the lens, he learned something about metalwork so that he could mount them. He mounted the lenses of some of his microscopes in silver and gold, though it's hard to see where he got the money to pay for such precious metals. When he was about 40, he closed his dry goods shop. He had had 2 wives, but they had both died, and his children were grown. He had been given the post of beadle in a church, work that did not require much attention, and his daughter Maria kept house for him. Now his happy days began. He took the microscopes he had made and looked at everything he could find: a hair, the brain of a fly, the wing of a moth, a bit of dust. He looked at such things over and over again, marveling, and his neighbors thought him a little queer, but one of them, sensing his genius, wrote to the Royal Society in London about him. The Royal Society invited him to correspond with them. Not long after that, he had indeed something to tell them. He had focused his microscope on a drop of water from a rain barrel, and had found in it, to his great astonishment, little beasties swimming about. Again and again he had seen the, quote, wretched beasties, unquote. They were, quote, moving about very nimbly, because they were furnished with divers incredibly thin feet, unquote. He began to write more and more about his discovery. He had found the little creatures not only in rainwater, but in pond water, and in the secretions of various animals, and even in the saliva of his own mouth. In long rambling letters in Dutch, all interspersed with tales of his stupid neighbors and the doings of the town of Delft, he told of the beasties he had found. Quote, they stand still, and 'twere upon a point, and they turn themselves around with that swiftness, as we see a top turn round the circumference they made being no bigger than that of a fine grain of sand. Unquote. Later he wrote, quote, this last kind of animal is 1,000 times smaller than the eye of a large louse. Unquote. Again he described, quote, an incredible number of little animals of various sorts, which move very prettily, which tumble about and sideways, this way and that. Unquote. The Royal Society did not believe him at first, but he wrote that many people in Delft had seen his little beasties. He offered to send affidavits from, quote, 2 men of God, 1 notary public, and 8 other persons worthy to be believed. Unquote. Would he send them one of his microscopes then, or tell them how they had been made? This he would not do. Then the Royal Society sent 2 of its most eminent members to see him, and he lifted down one of the 100-odd microscopes from the cabinet that lined his room, and they saw what he had seen. Leeuwenhoek was made a Fellow of the Royal Society after all. A whole succession of eminent people came to pay him their respects. One of them was Peter the Great of Russia. He let his visitors look through his microscope, but kept a close watch lest one of the instruments be stolen. He continued to find all manner of strange little organisms, although he did not realize that they might have any connection with disease. He found other things. One day he found a human sperm and said, according to one authority, that he saw a tiny small man in it with a body, legs, and head. He discovered that vermin do not breed out of filth, but come from eggs laid there by their predecessors. He discovered that plant aphids reproduce without fertilization by the male. Occasionally, as in the matter of the human sperm, he could not resist making a good story of the things he saw, but generally he reported accurately, as a scientist should. He said, quote, my determination is not to remain stubbornly with my ideas, but to leave them and go over to others as soon as I am shown plausible reasons which I can grasp. This is more true, since I have no other purpose than to place the truth before my eyes so far as it is in my power to embrace it, and to use the little talent I have received to draw the world away from its old heathenish superstitions and go over to the truth and to stick to it. Unquote. Old Anton von Leeuwenhoek's discovery of microbes was to start a new field of investigation. Many men were soon examining the little beasties, arguing about their origin and their behavior. Louis Pasteur, in the 19th century, was to demonstrate the germ theory of disease and open up the whole new field of bacteriology. But although Signor Malpighi, Jan Swammerdam, and Anton van Leeuwenhoek made very great contributions, their work lacked direction. It was scattered over many different fields as to leave the scientists who followed them in a state of confusion. That is why, in the age that followed theirs, the natural scientists cared about nothing so much as classifying the information they had. That is why Linnaeus is so important.